up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev, and this episode we're going to start Chapter 7 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, entitled As Long as Grass Grows or Water Runs. Remember, if you like what you hear, if you enjoy this episode, hit the like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell. And let's dig in. Chapter 7. If women of all the subordinate groups in a society dominated by rich white males were closest to home, indeed in the home, the most interior, then the Indians were the most foreign, the most exterior. Women, because they were so near and so needed, were dealt with more by patronization than by force. We mansplained to them. The Indian, not needed, indeed an obstacle, could be dealt with by sheer force, except that sometimes the language of paternalism preceded the burning of villages. And so Indian removal, as it has been politely called, cleared the land for white occupancy between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, cleared it for cotton in the south and grain in the north, for expansion, immigration, canals, railroads, new cities, and the building of a huge continental empire clear across to the Pacific Ocean. The cost in human life cannot be accurately measured. In suffering, not even roughly measured. Most of the history books given to children pass quickly over it. Statistics tell the story. We find these in Michael Rogan's Fathers and Children. In 1790, there were 3,900,000 Americans, and most of them lived within 500 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. By 1830, there were 13 million Americans, and by 1840, 4.5 million had crossed the Appalachian Mountains into the Mississippi Valley. That huge expanse of land crisscrossed by rivers flowing into the Mississippi from east and west. In 1820, 120,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi. By 1844, fewer than 30,000 were left. Most of them had been forced to migrate westward. But the word force cannot convey what happened. And I don't think his statistics really convey what happened. He tried, though. In the Revolutionary War, almost every important Indian nation fought on the side of the British. The British signed for peace and went home. The Indians already were home, and they continued fighting the Americans on the frontier. It is a set of desperate holding operations. Washington's war-enfeebled militia could not drive them back. After scouting forces were demolished one after the other, he tried to follow a policy of conciliation. His Secretary of War, Henry Knox, said, "The Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right to the soil." His Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, said in 1791 that where Indians lived within state boundaries, they should not be interfered with, and that the government should remove white settlers who tried to encroach on them. But as whites continued to move westward, the pressure on the national government increased. By the time Jefferson became president in 1800, there were 700,000 white settlers west of the mountains. They moved into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and in the north, into Alabama and Mississippi in the south. These whites outnumbered the Indians about 8-1. Jefferson now committed the federal government to promote future removal of the Creek and the Cherokee from Georgia. aggressive activity against the Indians mounted in the Indiana Territory under Governor William Henry Harrison. When Jefferson doubled the size of the nation by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, thus ending the western frontier from the thus extending the western frontier from the Appalachians across the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, he thought the Indians could move there. He proposed to Congress that Indians should be encouraged to settle down on smaller tracts and do farming. Also, they should be encouraged to trade with whites, to incur debts, and then to pay off these debts with tracts of land. Two measures are deemed expedient. First, to encourage them to abandon hunting. Secondly, to multiply trading houses among them, leading them thus to agriculture, to manufactures, and civilization. Jefferson's talk of agriculture, manufactures, civilization is crucial. Indian removal was necessary for the opening of the vast American lands to agriculture, to commerce, to markets, to money, to the development of the modern capitalist economy. Land was indispensable for all this, and after the Revolution, huge sections of land were bought up by rich speculators, including George Washington and Patrick Henry. In North Carolina, rich tracts of land belonging to the Chickasaw Indians were put on sale, although the Chickasaw were among the few Indian tribes fighting on the side of the Revolution, and a treaty had been signed with them guaranteeing their land. John Donaldson, a state surveyor, ended up with 20,000 acres of land near what is now Chattanooga. His son-in-law made 22 trips out of Nashville in 1795 for land deals. This was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a land speculator, merchant, slave trader, and the most aggressive enemy of the Indians in early American history. He became a hero of the War of 1812, which was not, as usually depicted in American textbooks, just a war against England for survival, but a war for the expansion of the new nation into Florida, into Canada, into Indian territory. Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief and noted orator, tried to unite the Indians against the white invasion. The way, and the only way, to check and to stop this evil is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land. And it was at first, and should yet be, for it was never divided, but belongs to all for the use of each. That no part has a right to sell, even to each other, much less to strangers, those who want all and will not do with less. Angered when fellow Indians were induced to cede a great tract of land to the United States government, Tecumseh organized in 1811 an Indian gathering of 5,000 on the bank of the Tallapoosa River in Alabama, and told them, "Let the white race perish. They seize your land, they corrupt your women, they trample on the ashes of your dead. Back whence they came upon a trail of blood they must be driven." The Creeks, who occupied most of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, were divided among themselves. Some were willing to adopt the civilization of the white man in order to live in peace. Others, insisting on their land and their culture, were called Red Sticks. The Red Sticks in 1813 massacred 250 people at Fort Mims, whereupon Jackson's troops burned down a Creek village, killing men, women, children. Jackson established the tactic of promising rewards in land and plunder. If either party, Cherokees, Friendly Creeks, or whites, takes property of the Red Sticks, the property belongs to those who take it. Not all his enlisted men were enthusiastic for the fighting, though. There were mutinies. The men were hungry. Their enlistment terms were up. They were tired of fighting and wanted to go home. Jackson wrote to his wife about the once brave and patriotic volunteers sunk to mere whining, complaining seditioners and mutineers. When a 17-year-old soldier who had refused to clean up his food and threatened his officer with a gun was sentenced to death by a court-martial, Jackson turned down a plea for commutation of sentence and ordered the execution to proceed. He then walked out of earshot of the firing squad. What a wuss. Jackson became a national hero when, in 1814, he fought the Battle of Horseshoe Bend against 1,000 Creeks and killed 800 of them, with few casualties on his side. His white troops had failed in a frontal attack on the Creeks, but the Cherokees with him promised governmental friendship if they joined the war, swam the river, came up behind the Creeks, and won the battle for Jackson. When the war ended, Jackson and friends of his began buying up the seized Creek lands. He got himself appointed treaty commissioner and dictated a treaty which took away half the land of the Creeks nation. Rogan says it was the largest single Indian secession of Southern American land. It took land from Creeks who fought with Jackson as well as those who had fought against him. And when Big Warrior, a chief of the friendly Creeks, protested, Jackson said, "Listen, the United States would have been justified by the Great Spirit had they taken all the land of the nation. Listen, the truth is the great body of the Creek chiefs and warriors did not respect the power of the United States. They thought we were an insignificant nation, that we would be overpowered by the British. They were fat with eating beef. They wanted flogging. We bleed our enemies in such cases to give them their senses." As Rogan puts it, Jackson had conquered the cream of the Creek country, and it would guarantee southwestern prosperity. He had supplied the expanding Cotton Kingdom with a vast and valuable acreage. Jackson's 1814 treaty with the Creeks started something new and important. It granted Indians individual ownership of land, thus splitting Indian from Indian, breaking up communal landholding, bribing some with land, leaving others out, introducing the competition and the conniving that marked the spirit of Western capitalism. It fitted well the old Jeffersonian idea of how to handle the Indians by bringing them into civilization. From 1814 to 1824, in a series of treaties with the southern Indians, whites took over 3/4 of Alabama and Florida, 1/3 of Tennessee, 1/5 of Georgia and Mississippi, and parts of Kentucky and North Carolina. Jackson played a key role in those treaties, and according to Rogan, his friends and relatives received many of the patronage appointments as Indian agents, traders, treaty commissioners, surveyors, and land agents. Jackson himself described how the treaties were obtained. We addressed ourselves feelingly to the predominant and governing passion of all Indian tribes, i.e. their avarice or fear. He encouraged white squatters to move into Indian lands, then told the Indians the government could not remove the whites, and so they had better cede the lands or be wiped out. He also, Rogan says, practiced extensive bribery. These treaties, these land grabs, laid the basis for the Cotton Kingdom, the slave plantations. Every time a treaty was signed, pushing the Creeks from one area to the next, promising them security there. Whites would move into the new area, and the Creeks would feel compelled to sign another treaty, giving up more land in return for security elsewhere. Jackson's work had brought the white settlements to the border of Florida, owned by Spain. Here were the villages of the Seminole Indians, joined by some Red Stick refugees and encouraged by British agents in their resistance to the Americans. Settlers moved into Indian lands. Indians attacked. Atrocities took place on both sides. When certain villages refused to surrender people accused of murdering whites, Jackson ordered the villages destroyed. Another Seminole provocation: escaped black slaves took refuge in Seminole villages. Some Seminoles bought or captured black slaves, but their form of slavery was more like African slavery than cotton plantation slavery. The slaves often lived in their own villages. Their children often became free. There was much intermarriage between Indians and blacks, and soon there were mixed Indian black villages, all of which aroused Southern slave owners who saw this as a lure to their own slaves seeking freedom. Jackson began raids into Florida, arguing it was a sanctuary for escaped slaves and for marauding Indians. Florida, he said, was essential to the defense of the United States. It was the classic modern preface to a war of conquest. Thus began the Seminole War of 1818, leading to the American acquisition of Florida. It appears on classroom maps politely as Florida Purchase 1819, but it came from Andrew Jackson's military campaign across the Florida border, burning Seminole villages, seizing Spanish forts until Spain was persuaded to sell. He acted, he said, by the immutable laws of self-defense. Really? Jackson then became governor of the Florida Territory. He was able now to give good business advice to friends and relatives. To a nephew, he suggested holding on to property in Pensacola. To a friend, a surgeon general in the army, he suggested buying as many slaves as possible because the price would soon rise. Leaving his military post, he also gave advice to officers on how to deal with the high rate of desertion. Poor whites, even if willing to give their lives at first, may have discovered the rewards of battle going to the rich. Jackson suggested whipping for the first two attempts, and the third time execution. Desertion. The leading books on the Jacksonian period, written by respected historians: The Age of Jackson by Arthur Schlesinger, The Jacksonian Persuasion by Marvin Myers, do not mention Jackson's Indian policy, but there is much talk in them of tariffs, banking, political parties, political rhetoric. If you look through high school textbooks and elementary school textbooks in American history, you will find Jackson the frontiersman, soldier, Democrat, man of the people, not Jackson the slaveholder, land speculator, executioner of dissident soldiers, exterminator of Indians. This is not simply hindsight, the word used for thinking back differently on the past. After Jackson was elected president in 1828 following John Quincy Adams, who had followed Monroe, who had followed Madison, who had followed Jefferson, the Indian Removal Bill came before Congress and was called at the time the leading measure of the Jackson administration and the greatest question that ever came before Congress, except for matters of peace and war. By this time, the two political parties were the Democrats and the Whigs, who disagreed on banks and tariffs, but not on issues crucial for the poor white, the blacks, the Indians, although some white working people saw Jackson as their hero because he opposed the rich man's bank. Under Jackson and the man he chose to succeed him, Martin Van Buren, 70,000 Indians east of the Mississippi were forced westward. In the north, there weren't that many, and the Iroquois Nation Confederation in New York stayed, but the Sac and Fox Indians of Illinois were removed. After the Black Hawk War, in which Abraham Lincoln was an officer, although he was not in combat, when Chief Black Hawk was defeated and captured in 1832, he made a surrender speech. "I fought hard, but your guns were well aimed. The bullets flew like birds in the air and whizzed by our ears like the wind through the trees in the winter. My warriors fell around me. The sun rose dim on us in the morning, and at night it sunk in a dark cloud and looked like a ball of fire. That was the last sun that shone on Black Hawk. He is now a prisoner to the white man. He has done nothing for which an Indian ought to be ashamed. He has fought for his countrymen, the squaws and papooses, against white men who came year after year to cheat them and take away their lands. You know the cause of our making war. It is known to all white men. They ought to be ashamed of it. Indians are not deceitful. The white men speak bad of the Indian and look at him spitefully, but the Indian does not tell lies. Indian does not steal. An Indian who is as bad as the white men could not live in our nation. He would be put to death and eaten up by the wolves. The white men are bad schoolmasters. They carry false books and deal in false actions. They smile in the face of the poor Indian to cheat him. They shake him by the hand to gain their confidence, to make them drunk, to deceive them, and ruin our wives. We told them to leave us alone and keep away from us. They followed on and beset our paths, and they coiled themselves among us like the snake. They poisoned us by their touch. We were not safe. We lived in danger. We were becoming like them, hypocrites and liars, adulterous, lazy drones, all talkers and no workers. The white men do not scalp the head, but they do worse. They poison the heart. Farewell, my nation. Farewell to Black Hawk." Black Hawk's bitterness may have come in part from the way he was captured. Without enough support to hold out against the white troops, with his men starving, hunted, pursued across the Mississippi, Black Hawk raised the white flag. The American commander later explained, "As we neared them, they raised a white flag and endeavored to decoy us, but we were a little too old for them. The soldiers fired, killing women and children as well as warriors. Black Hawk fled. He was pursued and captured by Sioux in the hire of the army." A government agent told the Sac and Fox Indians, "Our great father will forbear no longer. He has tried to reclaim them, and they grow worse. He is resolved to sweep them from the face of the earth. If they cannot be made good, they must be killed." The removal of the Indians was explained by Lewis Cass, Secretary of War, Governor of the Michigan Territory, Minister to France, presidential candidate. A principle of progressive improvement seems almost inherent in human nature. We are all striving in the career of life to acquire riches of honor or power or some other object whose possession is to realize the daydreams of our imaginations, and the aggregate of these efforts constitutes the advance of society. But there is little of this in the constitution of our savages. Cass, pompous, pretentious, honored, Harvard gave him an honorary degree of law in 1836, honorary doctor of law, at the height of Indian removal. Cass claimed to be an expert on the Indians, but he demonstrated again and again, in Richard Drinnan's words, a quite marvelous ignorance of Indian life. As governor of the Michigan Territory, Cass took millions of acres from the Indians by treaty. We must frequently promote their interest against their inclination. His article in the North American Review in 1830 made the case for Indian removal. We must not regret, he said, the progress of civilization and improvement, the triumph of industry and art by which these regions have been reclaimed, and over which freedom, religion, and science are extending their sway. He wished that all this could have been done with a smaller sacrifice, that the aboriginal population had accommodated themselves to the inevitable change of their condition. But such a wish was in vain. A barbarous people, depending for subsistence upon the scanty and precarious supplies furnished by the chase, cannot live in contact with a civilized community. Drennan comments on this in 1969. Here were all the necessary grounds for burning villages and uprooting natives, Cherokee and Seminole, and later Cheyenne, Philippine, and Vietnamese. If the Indians would only move to new lands across the Mississippi, Cass promised in 1825 at a treaty council with Shawnees and Cherokees, the United States will never ask for your land there. This I promise you in the name of your great father, the President. That country he assigns to his red people to be held by them and their children's children forever. The editor of the North American Review, for whom Cass wrote this article, told him that his project only defers the fate of the Indians. In half a century, their condition beyond the Mississippi will be just what it is now on this side. Their extinction is inevitable. As Drennan notes, Cass did not dispute this, yet published his article as it was. Everything in the Indian heritage spoke out against leaving their land. A council of Creeks offered money for their land, said, "We would not receive money for land in which our fathers and friends are buried." An old Choctaw chief said, responding years before to President Monroe's talk of removal, "I am sorry I cannot comply with the request of my father. We wish to remain here where we have grown up as the herbs of the woods, and do not wish to be transplanted into another soil." A Seminole chief had said to John Quincy Adams, "Here our navel strings were first cut, and the blood from them sunk into the earth, and made this country dear to us." Not all the Indians responded to the white officials' common designation of them as children and the President as father. It was reported that when Tecumseh met with William Henry Harrison, Indian fighter and future president, the interpreter said, "Your father requests you to take a chair." Tecumseh replied, "My father? The sun is my father and the earth is my mother. I will repose upon her bosom." It is a little weird hearing them talk about the president as their father. Like, do you really think of the current president as your father? Did you think of the last president as your father? How about the one before that? As soon as Jackson was elected president, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi began to pass laws to extend the state's rule over the Indians in their territory. These laws did away with the tribe as a legal unit, outlawed tribal meetings, took away the chief's powers, made the Indians subject to militia duty and state taxes, but denied them the right to vote, to bring suits, or to testify in court. Indian territory was divided up to be distributed by state lottery. Whites were encouraged to settle on Indian land. However, federal treaties and federal laws gave Congress, not the states, authorities over the tribes. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, passed by Congress in 1802, no, not that kind of intercourse, said there could be no land cessions except by treaty with the tribe, and said federal law would operate in Indian territory. Jackson ignored this and supported state action. It was a neat illustration of the uses of the federal system. Depending on the situation, blame could be put on the states or on something even more elusive, the mysterious law before which all men, sympathetic as they were to the Indian, must bow. As Secretary of War John Eaton explained to the Creeks of Alabama, Alabama itself was an Indian name meaning, "Here we may rest." I did not know that. "It is not your great father who does this, but the laws of the country, which he and every one of his people is bound to regard." And let's end there. I want to thank you for joining me. I do hope you'll join me for the next episode, and I do hope that you'll hit that like and subscribe button. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.